Hello, gang. Let's get you all ready to do great on exam 3. A couple of overhead points before we dive into the specific exam review. First of all, Lockdown Browser has put out a new piece of software. And so before you take the exam, you're going to want to make sure that you have the latest version of software for Lockdown Browser onto the device you're going to be using, the PC or iPad or whatever that you're going to use to take the exam. I'm not quite sure how that works. You got a postmaster about it. Just be aware of that and be ready for some potential issues. Remember too, the window is going to be open from 7:30 on Monday morning until 10 a.m. The 7:30 start is designed to give folks a little bit more flexibility to get started. Hopefully the problems we had with the last exam were just rush hour of a lot of people starting at 8. And so some of you easing in at 7:30 will eliminate that. Also, the exam only lasts for 60 minutes, so you don't have to log in at 8. You can wait until, I wouldn't wait as late as 9, but you can in theory wait as late as 9 to get your full hour before the exam closes at 10 a.m. Also, a couple of points about preparing for the exam. We have 4 chapters, but they're not an equal number of questions. There are fewer questions from chapters 10 and 11 than there are from 12 and 13, so a little bit more emphasis on chapters 12 and 13. Also, most of these subjects are very applied, and in a lot of cases, I talk through pros and cons of things quite a bit in class, or I should say on the videos. I think you're going to find reviewing the videos is going to be really important to doing well on the exam, in addition to perhaps going back and rereading some sections of the textbook that we're going to talk about. Okay, with all that introduction, let's start talking about Chapter 10. This is the governance chapter. Know that the issues arise when there's a separation of ownership and managerial control, which is not all that common in small and medium businesses. I don't think there's definitely no definition of agency relationship. I'm not even sure that word appears in the exam. No questions off of this slide. The questions off of this slide, or there'll be some important concepts off of this slide. The board of directors engages in monitoring and compensation, and both of those are the basis for a lot of questions in the exam. Specifically, the fact that the board of directors, particularly in cases of dilute ownership, represent the owners and apply. They're the ones who supervise the managers. Make sure you're familiar with the major tasks of the board of directors. And there's 2 important concepts on this slide, and I encourage you to be very familiar with them. Rewatch the videos, and also make sure you review the chapters. And that's the idea of board of director, insider director versus related outsider versus outsider director. The notion of a lead independent director or a lead outside director, and also the topic of CEO duality. The CEO also serving as the chairman or chairwoman of the board. So those are 3 topics you're going to make sure that you know really well. Also, there's 2 questions. I think there's 2 questions that have to do with CEO compensation. So make sure that you're very comfortable with that subject. There's a reference to third-party control, but it's not central to the question. Make sure you know the difference between a golden parachute, a green mail, and a poison pill. And there are no international questions, I don't think. But there is this mention of stewardship theory and CEO duality. So make sure you're familiar with that. And that should get you through Chapter 10. For Chapter 11, I'm not going to be able to give you some easy, straightforward pointers on the test questions, but I'm going to tell you exactly how all of the test questions derive. You see that we've got these parameters of accountability, responsibility, communication, and cost. Those are often going to drive a lot of the issues because most of the questions are going to center around this idea of which is best. So there is a question that talks about conditions where you might want to move from a functional organization to a multi-divisional organization and why that happened, and also some scenarios as to why that happens. Nothing about the simple structure, but the big ones that you need to know are the functional, know the pros and the cons, and how you can do both a cost leadership and a differentiation strategy from a functional organization. They all work with all the different strategies, although a functional organization is often particularly adept to do a cost leadership strategy. You absolutely can do a differentiation strategy from a functional organization. So don't fall into that trap. And then we have the multi-divisionals. Now there's a discussion, there's a question that says, do you know the difference of cooperative and how these product divisions sometimes share? There's a question about SBU, and there's also a question about the competitive form. There's also a question about the matrix and what are the pros and cons of a matrix solution. So it all revolves around the idea of pros and cons. So functional, multi-divisional, and furthermore, different types of multi-divisionals in the matrix. Make sure you know the pros and the cons of each. There is one question that's going to ask you to spot whether the global strategy, or it's a multinational strategy, whether they're using the multi-domestic, the global, or the transnational. It has a lot to do with, do you remember what these different words mean? So make sure you're up on those. And that's it for the chapter 11. Notice here that there are certain big parts of the chapter that are carved out from the exam, and there are no test questions on that. For chapter 12 on strategic leadership, I think there are 11 or 12 questions that come out of this chapter. So you're going to want to pay particular attention to this material. Also, there are a couple of questions that come specifically off of the videos where I'm talking about material that isn't in the chapter. So make sure that you're up on those. There's no specific question about the latitude or discretion of strategic leaders. However, understanding these factors, I think, sets you up to do very well on some of the questions that are going to come that relate back to this topic. There is a question to see whether you know the major functions of a strategic leader, and note that it's really not different than the textbook. This concept groups them along the lines of the red boxes. Whoops. Nothing about a vision and mission. There is a questions about human capital and social capital. So make sure you understand the differences between the two and the relative contributions of each to the organization. There are 2 questions about the balanced scorecard. Make sure you're familiar with what goes into each of these categories and why there is a balanced scorecard. Also, the difference between financial metrics and the other strategic metrics, why we use them, and the challenges involved. Several questions on organizational culture. That idea of it's how things get done around here. The fact that I think the fact that new companies are the easiest to set up a culture is there. No specifics on Amazon's culture, but you're going to want to make sure that you can apply these principles of how to change a culture. Likewise, into an ethical culture, clear code, explicit culture, and not a lawyer rule book kind of perspective is important. Nothing off of this particular slide. And then the last topic is CEO duality. There's a little bit of CEO duality again, and also a leader transition. So make sure you understand the difference between a heterogeneous and a homogeneous top management team and the pros and the cons of each. And be very familiar with this slide. There's 1 or 2 questions that you'll be able to answer if you can apply this slide. And that is it for chapter 12. As for chapter 13, it's going to be important that you're familiar with what creative destruction means, although not my specific examples from class. Very important that you understand why existing companies should be good at strategic entrepreneurship, and yet why they aren't. Make sure that you understand this very well. The textbook isn't as organized, I don't think, about this as I was in my video, so you're going to want to make sure you understand the videos. This idea of incremental versus radical, or as the textbook puts it, novel innovation, is the source of 2 or 3 questions. So make sure that you understand the differences, who does them, and what constitutes them. Nothing there. Another big comment is the idea of autonomous versus induced or top-down innovation. product champions being a part of that. Make sure you know the pros and the cons of each and that you can see them. Again, remember this idea of organ rejection, which is my medical metaphor that says the reason a lot of big firms struggle with this is that they get new ideas, but when the new idea is introduced into the major or the larger corporation, it's rejected because people oppose it, and it had to do with the politics and why this is so hard. The idea of cross-functional teams, there's one or two questions on this, so make sure that you're familiar with this. And again, I think the textbook's got a good section here. There are no direct questions on the idea of innovating externally, but understanding those principles may help you clarify some of the other application questions. And I thought that what Jeff Bezos has to say on this topic is so profound, I wrote a test question off of this discussion from class. So there's the exam 3 review. Again, 60 minutes, 40 multiple choice questions. You'll be using the respondents monitor. And as always, you're allowed to have a 1-page cheat sheet to use for the exam. Good luck.